I'd like to go ahead and introduce Rob from Cloudrise. We knew him from Deloitte and in his role there, but starting a new exciting startup, and excited to hear more about his presentation and role in the industry. So Rob, I'll go ahead and let you transition to presenter rights.
Great, Brent. Thank you very much, and thanks for having us today. So appreciate everybody joining the web conference. We know everybody's busy, so we always appreciate people's valuable time. So I'm Rob Eggebrecht, and I'm the CEO of a company called Cloudrise. If you go and Google it or try to go to the website, we're actually still in what the Silicon Valley likes to call stealth mode. But a little bit of background I'll just do quickly, and then we'll jump into the case study. As we were founded in October of 2019. So it's a group of professionals that I've worked with in the past. We had founded a company called IntelliSecure that focused on data loss prevention, a lot of on-premise work for about 15 years. And then several of us transitioned over into Deloitte into their cloud cyber risk practices leaders, as well as their data risk area. And so we actually have some leadership that came over from Netscope as well. So it's a good mix of people. And later in the presentation, you'll get a real flavor for what we're up to specifically, and I'll try to apply it to this use case. So give me just a second here, and I'm going to share my screen if I can. There we go. And hopefully you guys should all be able to see the screen, correct? I'll take that as a yes.
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 Excellent. So what we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to move past this, is really a heavy emphasis on so the use case is an actual project that we've worked on in the last 6 months. And it's a global organization that was formulating, actually had about a $300 million budget for a project that was heavily driven by computing analytics in a data lake environment. And so when the organization came to us, they said, you know what, we're not new to the cloud, but this is a large initiative for the organization. It's heavily business driven. What they were really looking for, just to give everybody an update, along with the presentation, we're just finalizing, it's a solution brief white paper that will hopefully convey the same message that I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes about the use case. So as a follow-up or an add-on through the CSA, you'll be able to get this solution brief, and it should hopefully clearly articulate what we're going to talk about today. But this firm is global in nature. They weren't new to the cloud. They were in it from a SaaS perspective, an infrastructure perspective. But I think what was really new and unique was the amount of emphasis that the business had put on leveraging a data lake environment to gain competitive advantage and really structure that data lake to map to the needs of product managers and the general managers of those 4 business units to, one, understand how products were sold, how they were being priced in the marketplace. This was a consumer goods product company. And to take analytics of what it took to cost to build the products, take them to market, understand better information about their supply chain. And so you had all of these different feeds coming into a cloud data lake environment and then being moved out. So it was a significant project for them. And they really got I would say, up close and personal view of shared responsibility model and the need to have a very orchestrated viewpoint when it came from management. So you had the business leaders that drove the requirements. They brought those to the CIO, who kind of said, here's what we have in place today. And the CTO said, here's what we can build and augment for what we have in place today. And then they brought in the chief privacy officer and the CISO to take a look at balancing risk, reducing risk, and also meeting some of the really quickly changing privacy environments due to GDPR, CCPA, and some of the older requirements, frankly, card data as well as HIPAA. So when a lot of organizations are looking at these problems, this is actually a slide that we used when we were doing fundraising for Cloudrise, as well as in our corporate overview deck. And I think our approach, you're not going to hear a lot about threat management today and what I'll call bits, bytes, and signature in regards to the cloud computing environment and risk. Where our background and where you're going to see a heavy emphasis on today's case study is talking about data privacy. So data security, privacy, and those implications in the cloud and how that really affected the way that they provision the data lake, they operate the data lake, and ultimately how they share the information that's a product of the processing. So as we know, data creation, it's happening faster than we've ever seen it. The shared responsibility model, especially in this case, the organization had to look at reliance of the feeds coming into the data lake. And I'll show you a diagram that'll better explain this, but also the IaaS infrastructure itself, and then the analytics platforms they were using. Another thing that we'll talk about a lot today is point solutions when it comes to protecting data lake environments. So as we all know, there's a lot of talk about cloud access security brokers, cloud security posture management. There's a lot of lingo and buzzwords out there. What we're going to try to do is show you how this organization looked at existing tools, some of those actually premise-based like traditional data loss prevention, but also orchestrated the cloud security gateways and their CSPMs to look at how do you get a holistic view of visibility of data that's moving into the data lake, and then once it's in there, visibility and controls of how it's manipulated, getting an understanding if they've had any data leakage into the environment, nevertheless from being an exfiltrated perspective. And then the privacy complexities. So this is a global organization and they're taking consumer information from a global basis because they want to understand by region how to price products, who's using their products. And so that became a very interesting discussion topic for them as well when it got into risk. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides. I think we all know the world. Enterprise security used to look a lot, it was a lot simpler. And when I talk about data lakes, specifically, I always like to take a step back and put myself in the shoes. In this case, we can't use the client's exact name, but we call them Global Co. In the case of Global Co, they had a really, really smart team that understood that in the old world environment, a data lake to them was really master database management. So an MDM solution that lived on premise, it had a data store, it had underlying tools. For them, it was private lines or ATM frame relay. Ways of accessing it were very fixed diagrams. And then from a reporting perspective, they looked at things like Excel spreadsheets. It could even be a Tableau or Power BI, but more traditional reporting tools that lived on premise. They would write the queries there and everything was sitting behind the firewall. Well, now that team that was so used to that environment, they're very smart, but they were now looking at, hey, we're going to implement Azure in the cloud with all of these different analytic capabilities and underlying blob data infrastructure. And now they live in this world where everything is kind of being fed from endpoints, mobile, IoT, and what that equated to is what they did not want to happen, and they had seen it happen in smaller projects inside their organization, which is the idea of this clean data lake where only appropriate people accessed it, information hit a landing zone, and as expected, the information was processed and moved out of the enrichment area into the analytics platforms. But what they found in some of their other projects were the questions that we like to stimulate conversation with people, which is, do you have proper data privacy and governance standards for your data lake? And another thing I hope is a key takeaway today is we found with a lot of organizations is they try to solve world peace when it comes to their data lake initiatives. So they'll look at their entire cybersecurity program, and then sometimes they've carved out specific controls and approach to cloud security. And they then start going, well, I have to apply all of this to this specific data lake. if data lakes are new initiatives to your organization, or they've only been smaller projects, but now they turn into something that's transformational for the business. And in this case with Global Co, a $300 million investment with all of the key leadership taking a stake inside it from a financial perspective and a management perspective, it provides a unique opportunity, and we call it initiative-based cyber. And what we mean by that is you have the opportunity to readdress how you approach not only cloud security, but really data and some of the privacy approaches that you're going to want to look at. And so when we look at these questions, would you know if new data lake was created by a user within your organization? Well, if I can figure that out for this data lake project, I've probably figured out a pretty good control mechanism for understanding the provisioning of cloud services in general, whether it's a SaaS app or an IaaS environment. And again, leveraging things you might have that might tie into third-party contracting, because generally what you'll find is we're working with a SaaS provider and as an IaaS provider. So if it's Salesforce or Microsoft or AWS, that's a third party. And sometimes you can tie in those third-party risk controls, and they already exist, and now you just apply them to that initiative. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Again, if you download get the white paper, we actually talk about that a little more in detail. Would you know if confidential information is exfiltrated out of the data lake? I think that is just as important as would you know if the wrong information is being ingested into the data lake? And then do you have visibility into what type of data is uploaded? And that gets into the ingestion question. Ultimately, what we want to make sure of is you stay to the left of this diagram and it doesn't turn into the right. And again, when it comes to cloud computing in general, what I find is a lot of people start to lose the battle they have lost in the last 20 years in cybersecurity because their eyes get very large and they're trying to solve for world peace, meaning they want to solve for every possible option when it comes or instance of cloud computing. Data lake projects like this provide a really unique opportunity to kind of box the scope. A little bit of the team's background from Cloudrise is about 20 years ago, we started out as BS 7799 consultants, which ultimately turned into ISO 27001. The reason why I bring that up is what was driven into our minds from a very early stage when doing ISO projects, it really didn't matter if it was 9001 for manufacturing or 27001 for cyber, was the fact that if you could build a very defined scope and you could be successful in an environment with that scope, then chances are you could replicate that model into different environments. And if you were really good at it, to various sizes, so you could begin to scale it. So when I look at this diagram, this is Global Co and their data lake. And this is an overview, a very simplified overview, but it has the traditional elements. The source information is coming from, we just bifurcated it into simple cloud feeds and on-premise feeds. So here, in a massive SAP global deployment, it has a tremendous amount of their product information that's going to feed into this data lake. They also had other feeds of what I'll call on-premise information driving into their master database management. That's what MDM stands for. And so you had a very large piece of information coming from a traditional firewalled environment, moving into the landing zone. And then from a cloud perspective, they were taking information from a sales perspective, distribution from Salesforce. They were trying to get interesting information out of Workday on the amount of time that people were spending on the products and services. Concur had the expense management link to that. And then it was, as I said, it was a consumer products organization. They actually have distribution out into all of these different areas where people are consuming their products that's being measured by IoT devices. So now they're actually getting usage from an what I call a cluster of IoT globally. And all of this is hitting the landing zone. So those are your sources. And the thing I like to tell people is if you can, if security has been really well applied from a SaaS perspective and an on-prem perspective and an IaaS perspective coming in, you're going to have a lot better opportunity to feel confident that you can have good security controls coming into the landing zone, whether it is authorized access or content. Then here you had a processing zone. Think of that as where data enrichment's really taking place. That analytic zone is refining that enrichment to the point where it gets here. You can see they had expense cubes, sales cubes. All of this was set up, just to be honest, in a Azure environment. That blob database was the underlying data store. And then what they were doing is they were moving the information out of the data lake. And when they were moving it out, what I like to note is a lot of people see the insight zone as reporting and dashboards. In many cases, before it gets to that insight zone, I look at this as raw materials manufacturing. So the sources is kind of the piles of raw materials at the mine. The mine itself is the data lake. And by the time that the trucks are taking the enriched materials out, they have a tremendous amount of value. I almost go from saying that goes from data into information. So there's another point where information can be exfiltrated, whether it's maliciously or inadvertently, and that's from the data lake just getting to the insight zone. We want to have some good control of visibility there, because a lot of people, I think, skip that step and they start to look really at their exfiltration controls starting at the insight zone. So this is a data lake. These are fairly traditional. If I put AWS or GCP containers against it, and you could have machine learning queries, big queries, things like that from a Google perspective. The idea is the structures will really start to look very similar when you're out in the wild. So what I wanted to do is break this up into areas of visibility. And again, we're not going to talk about threat management and endpoint controls. We could head down that route, but our real focus at Cloudrise and how we were brought in, or why we were brought in with this client engagement, was really to understand data security and privacy and the impacts on this data lake and how to address it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a governance scheme, but also technical controls that what I find is are in place in many cases, and they are vastly underutilized to solve the problem of a cloud-based data lake. And some people sit there and go, well, you know what, I don't need on-premise DLP to solve a cloud issue from a data lake perspective. And I would argue that one of so let's take a step back. What we're trying to call out in this slide is, let's get some visibility right off the bat on who has access to the landing zone and what sort of data can be put in it. Because if we start getting to prevent that data swamp, what we want to clearly understand is who has access to that data lake. And in many cases, and this is where we're starting to leverage parts of the cyber program that have probably been built at a macro level, and then we can apply them to the governance of the data lake. So the first step that I would encourage any of you to take is not to rely on general governance of database, and in this case, infrastructure and maybe app management. That's probably all in place, but if you had a specific governance structure that you know that you're going to be rolling out a lot of these environments of various sizes, what I would do is build what you would call a generic data lake data privacy and security governance plan or governance model. And then you could apply that specifically. And so when I look at this, the first thing I want to understand is what's feeding the data lake, what sort of applications, and then apply any identity and access management solutions I have that are probably already existing, and ensure that who has access to actually drop off materials into the landing zone. If they don't have access, they should never allowed to make that connection from Salesforce, to enable the IoT bits and bytes to throw into the environment, or to make that connection from SAP or MDM. And that could be a combination. Again, there's different, what's interesting about a lot of these tools, especially in the cloud spaces, it's tremendously fragmented right now. There's a lot of overlap. Like a CASB, a cloud access security broker, well, it has elements of identity access, it has elements of DLP, it has a little bit of element of threat management. What we're trying to do at this phase of data lake from a security and risk management perspective is, one, completely understand who has access to this specific data lake. From a CASB perspective, we'd like to understand what sources do, and then we can add that DLP component. So from Salesforce or Workday or Concur, we can get a view of what's being uploaded into the environment. For Global Co specifically, there was absolutely zero need for them ever to see card data inside this environment. There was also zero need to see specific elements of European consumers. So from a GDPR citizenry perspective, these were no-goes. They should never see the data inside the environment. So from an access control perspective, we could look at specific users, groups of users, but then also the source data origination. And then really looking from a granular perspective, from an on-premise perspective, we saw that there was secure file transfer that would happen from the MDM and the SAP instances into the landing zone. That's where your on-premise DLP came into place. So we actually helped them harmonize rules that would understand from a cloud transfer or from an on-premise transfer, leveraging their existing CASB that had DLP capabilities and their on-prem DLP, we could take control and actually use the prevention to make sure the wrong data never got into the data lake. And I think this is a huge piece of data lake management, because how these things turn into data swamps is, frankly, there's too many users that are accessing it. And then if you've locked that down, in many cases, it's the wild west of what sort of data you can upload. A lot of that is never malicious intent. It's just someone takes a table of information from a data store and they move it up there, and they probably only needed X amount of specific rows or tabular or unstructured information. Unfortunately, they were, could be lazy. They were just in a hurry, so they grabbed the bulk amount of information, moved it up there, and they're like, well, I'll just run a query once it's in the data lake to capture the information. The problem is you've already created the data swamp at that point by moving the bulk data up. These controls, if orchestrated, typically in a lot of organizations, can be applied to prevent what we call bad data ingestion. Questions? I figured I'd take those at the end, but if anyone had anything burning, I'm happy to answer it. The next piece is just general data governance around the data lake. So we've talked about that. We're not big believers. And as you heard some of our background, we spent a lot of the people on the team spent about 2 or 3 years in one of the big four as we were transitioning from our usual startup world mode into Cloudrise now. What we noticed is there's a tremendous amount of spreadsheets and PowerPoints being created when it comes to governance. But frankly, there's not a lot of actionable governance that's put in place that is tied to technology, automation, and orchestration. And that's frankly what we're starting to really drive with our clients. So in this case, you have the data governance. The data lake is up and running. So let's assume that we've got really good controls on the ingestion. Another piece that we want to look at is once all of these elements are set up. So inside, if you're familiar with Azure, this is multiple components of software and access control mechanisms within that software, compute. AWS, it would be the same thing. Frankly, with GCP, it would be the same thing, or IBX Bluemix. The point I want to make is there's tools out there, specifically Cloud Security Posture Management or CWPP sort of tools. And that's what we found in this organization that was very helpful to get a clear understanding of what do the configurations look like on the different components. Is there public access set up? So irregardless how IAM is set up, if we have it where no public access is set to specific infrastructure or tables, then it doesn't matter who's accessing it. It provides that additional layer of controls. So if the wrong data does get into the data lake or we have provisioned access, that we've got another control mechanism. And so what we found is these CSPM tools really worked well for Cloud Code. Tools like that can be Netscope is integrated in, Palo Alto, Redlock, Twistlock. I mean, I can go down the list. This isn't a commercial for any specific tools. The point I want to make here is there's a lot of people already have these technology capabilities they built into the governance program. Now I have a continuous check of configs inside the manufacturing plant, And I can also do IaaS discovery scans, so discovery scans on that blob database. So if information did somehow sneak in, unbeknownst to us, let's say card data had gotten into GlobalCo and it was sitting in that blob database, I could actually be running discovery scans looking for that information. So now essentially what I've done is built controls inside the manufacturing department of the data lake. So as we move towards the right, really what you're doing is you're moving towards highly refined data, enriched to the point where it has tremendous value to the business. And when we met with the management team at GlobalCo, you know, this is where a lot of their initial thoughts were centered around from a risk perspective. And we had to kind of coach them on, hey, fix it at the ingestion area before it becomes a problem, double check it while it's in the manufacturing plant. But then the questions that you constantly receive when information is moving out of these data lake environments is, you know, does your organization have visibility into who's receiving that information? Who has access to request information? And in the white paper, I break this out into the concepts of push or pull. And these aren't new concepts by any means. If you're familiar with the old world of secure email, you could either have it pushed to you, you double click on the file inside the email, makes a call out to the secure mail gateway and authenticates, and that's push method. So I look at from a reporting perspective out of a data lake, it's very similar. You have identified your audience, you've identified the information they should receive, and you're actually pushing or driving that information out to them, whether that's through an email, a Slack channel, some sort of collaboration tool. From a pull perspective, these could be these on-prem downstream apps, but they could also sit up here in the insight zone as dashboards. But really what you're doing there is you're providing people that ability to go to a web-based portal, click on a link, take you to the information, where then you are pulling that information down. And so when we looked at this environment for GlobalCo with their data lake, they wanted to share information with a lot of people. So they wanted to get it out into their field force. They wanted to make sure that they had query writers that could go into, in this case, it was Power BI, write some pretty amazing queries and then push the information out. They wanted to get out to their specific members of their supply chain. So you have all of this very enriched data that's now turned into valued information. It should drive competitive analysis around a competitive advantage around the pricing of their products, inventory of their products, how they're using their suppliers, compensate. I mean, this went so deep, it went into compensation plans wrapped around specific products to incentivize sales. It was fascinating to see the data that they had created as a byproduct of the capabilities of the data lake. So the first point I wanted to make is that gap between the data lake and the insight zone. And I was talking about that earlier. Just seeing that hop, it's a really interesting piece, because if you think about it, that blob storage or the data lake itself, it doesn't matter whether it moves to a push platform or a pull platform, those bytes of information have to leave, in this case, that Azure environment. And what we found is that when it was transported from the cloud environment back down prem, it either went through a web proxy over some sort of ICAP connection, through a private line itself, very rare in those cases, or secure FTP. And then from the cloud piece, it was generally moving cloud to cloud. And so the CASB that was in place, and if you think about this also, it's using the same tools to provide that layer. I think a lot of people kind of think CASB, I'm going to look at uploads, and DLP, I'm just going to look at prem. What we found is you could leverage the same technology and orchestrate it really eloquently to achieve different areas of security controls. So on the way in, you were looking at quality and containment, and on the way out, you were looking at control, containment, and also quality as well. Identity and access management, again, played a huge role on who could access the platforms for the information, and defining those by group, region, the type of person, and once again, the final downloads of information cloud to cloud, you could use the CASB. And then from a DLP perspective, anytime we saw that information heading down into the environment, or in some cases there was web connect into those environments, we could use what was called a web proxy sort of solution. So that is in a nutshell. I'm going to go to our slide, but how we approach data lake security. So this is what we offer, and I just wanted to talk about some of the things and how we layer this approach. I don't want this to be a commercial, but what I want you to understand is how we worked with CloudCo when we looked at that data lake. And the first thing was we went in and we did some assessment work. And I think when you're looking at organizations to help you when it comes to assessments, there's a lot of organizations that will come out there and tell you how to build the program and the risks associated that you're trying to block. I think the next paradigm shift that we're trying to work on with our clients is initiative based. So with the data lake project that we just went over, our objective through our assessment was not, again, to show all of the risks and every tool you needed. It was to gain a clear understanding of the outcomes they were trying to get from the data lake, which was what information are you trying to get to what organizations that has value that shows return on investment to the business. And then we regressed back from the insight zone into the data lake and back to the sources. And our idea was first of all, what's the governance going to look like to protect that? How do you operate it so it's going to be fast and agile for the business? And then how can you start to calculate what can be done manually and then what can reasonably be done from an automated perspective? And the next thing that we would look at is the technologies. Well, in this organization's case, they had a lot of Microsoft. And so we were able to actually enable MCAS from a CASB perspective inside their environment. They had on-premise Symantec, now Broadcom DLP. We're able to orchestrate that. And we started tying all the in from a privacy perspective. They were just embarking about a tool called Big ID that allowed them to look at where specific subject information was and to remove those inside specific data stores. So that was nice because we could point it at the blob infrastructure, and we were constantly doing real-time scans on if we had EU data inside that environment, because we said on the ingestion zone earlier, we absolutely did not want it. From a cloud security gateway, they were using a little bit of Netscope as well as Redlock. So really where we see the value coming and being driven higher and higher is lots of people can do the assessment work and lots of people can deploy technology, but where we think the rubber hits the road, not only in these data lake projects, but moving forward, is the ability to calculate how much it takes to maintain those, what you can automate, what needs to be done manually, and how can you get a single lens of information for that outcome. And so that's where we get in and we actually apply kind of a security operations and automated response process to it. And then in some cases, the clients have us manage those processes. But when we look at what we're trying to achieve with those customers, with those tool sets and the outcomes, are essentially how do you harmonize policies? Like I have a DLP solution on premise, and I have one in my CASB. If I have to log into both of those and build policy logic to protect the ingestion or the exfiltration, that's a lot of time for people to have to deal with it. But if I could harmonize that policy logic and push it out, and then I had a workbook or a playbook that I could apply that to the next data lake and the next data lake, then suddenly the standardized approach to these environments, you begin to become much more adept at quickly applying them, and you get consistency of security across them. And then the unified reporting and analytics, I think that's one of the pieces that GlobalCo really found value when working with us, because we were able to take siloed information out of Symantec DLP, out of Netscope, out of their Microsoft MCAS environment, and give them a unified picture of who is accessing this environment, who shouldn't have been, what sort of data was moving in, why did it move there, and that gave them that consolidated risk view. So this is just kind of shows you how we go about it. We execute playbooks against platforms. point them towards the target. So in this case, we'd be pointing it towards hybrid environments as well as the cloud data lake. And then people are like, oh, you're just another MSSP. We're not anything like an MSSP. We actually try to solve the problem above the MSSPs by automating all the playbooks and generate and orchestrating these tools. And we focus on data and privacy platforms, but then we push the information and we typically bifurcate it. So in the case with one of our clients right now, we put security related information that comes out of those platforms, the DLPs, the CASBs, the privacy piece, and that information goes down to the SOC. And what the SOC loves about it is we reduce the incidents they have to triage because they get much more accurate signals from those devices because the policies have actually been harmonized. They've gone through an SDLC process. And then the business, it's really neat because we'll send specific information over, whether it's ServiceNow, IT, Slack, or email, but we'll figure out exactly who's the audience, how they like to see a report. So rather than giving CSV files or reports that are generated based on the requirements of those specific tools as Symantec, Netscope, ForcePoint, again, it's a partial list, but rather than reporting in each one of those silos and giving a different report feel, we actually deliver reports that have enriched all that data and poured it out. And I think all of this is in the idea to optimize and streamline. That's it. So I think I made it through in time, but questions, I'd be happy. I like to keep this interactive and share any of the experiences that we've had. This is not our only data lake project. We've worked on numerous ones that are leveraging, again, Google's been pretty interesting with their machine learning auto ML tables and their big query sort of capabilities and high drive on analytics. And we've also done a lot of work in AWS. So any questions for me today?
So, Rob, just kind of curious in terms of, you know, when you look at some of the DLP and CASB programs that are out there, you know, some members have expressed challenges with, you know, scale and having those solutions match and perform correctly to the volume of records that they're trying to analyze. Do you see you know, this area kind of solving for some of those scaling issues?
So I think the answer to that question is not necessarily the tech, it's the program. And I'll give you an example. So I've seen a global organization that just uses DLP to look for the equivalent social security numbers, national insurance numbers, those equivalents. There's strings of numeric information that can be what's called exact data or fingerprinted. And you do it for 700,000 people globally. And you almost have, you know, like a 0.25 rate on false positives. Where I can go over to another organization that has 60 some policies set up that are very descriptive, using tags, using a combination of indexing, exact data matching, regex, and they have a much higher false positive rate, and it takes much more to administer that system because of the constant changing and evolution of their intellectual property. Where I think the step back comes is this: we talk about initiative-based projects. So this data lake project, when we went into this organization, they had multiple data lakes. They have a huge amount still left on premise. Rather than going in and trying to tune the CASB or the DLP solution to try to look for all this information everywhere, what we did is we specifically tailored it to look at the requirements that this data lake wanted to achieve and the outcomes. And so what we found is in this program, in the white paper, it's called like the Advanced Product Development. It actually had a much cooler, catchy project name inside the organization, but they had outcomes. They knew exactly what they wanted to get, which was, you know, a more competitive product, priced lower, higher returns, information out to these specific people. And they also had a pretty clear indication of the competitors who would be interested in this, the suppliers. And so it makes it a lot easier to tune a DLP-based solution or an access-based solution around that environment. And then what I find is if you start with a smaller scope, and the team that started Cloudrise, we have over 15 years of DLP experience. What's always consistent is once you get really good at it in one environment and you can prove it and you can show the value, you get the team comfortable with it, and then you can start to expand it out into different initiatives. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
But the CASB market's very tricky right now. It's very fragmented. You know, the Zscalers and the Palo Altos, they're very network centric, where the Sky Highs, now McAfee and the Netscopes, and the Symantec's, now Broadcom, are much more data centric. And I think the key is you just have to understand the outcome, and then you start to look at the tools that are capable of helping you automate that.
That makes sense. And you mentioned your white paper. Again, that's going to be coming out at RSA. Is that correct?
We're hoping it's actually going to come up, be out on the presses by tomorrow and delivered to you guys.
Oh, great. Okay.
I didn't finish my homework assignment on time.
That'll make for a good follow-up.
Perfect.
Great. Well, folks, any other questions, comments, thoughts for Rob?
Great. I hope this was helpful. And as the current slide says, we'll be launching the company at the RSA show. We're actually going to be kind of doing that with the Cloud Security Alliance platform on the Monday event. So if you're at the event, stop by. I think we're going to be near a coffee booth. Who wouldn't want to be near a coffee booth in San Francisco in February?